think what I am going to do is to do a pen and ink with watercolor version, because I like that style a lot. Generally, when you're doing that, you start with a pencil drawing, so that way you get the pencil drawing just the way that you want it, and then you trace it over with ink, and then you watercolor it in with color. So it's a 3-step process. So we have now finished step 1, which is the drawing it with pencil. We happen to do it with the tracing process, but you could draw it with pencil freehand. And the benefit of doing it with pencil first is that if there's any corrections and stuff that you want to make to it, it's fairly easy to do that with pencil. It's much harder to do a correction once you've got something in ink. When you're drawing in pencil, it's good to have a sharp pencil, and it's good to have an external eraser, because the erasers that come on the back of the regular pencils, like that, generally are pretty awful. So instead of fighting with the eraser that comes with the pencil, this is my cat Suzu coming to visit, coming to step on the keyboard. So she typed BHHHHHH. That is her secret message to you. Alright, she has wandered off. So external erasers are quite inexpensive and are very, very worth it to save you a lot of grief and agony. So I highly recommend getting an external eraser. So once you have drawn your design, whether you traced it or drew it freehand, onto your paper, erase that little bit there. And I will note that graphite from tracing paper tends to be harder to erase than regular pencil is, so I would go light. I went pretty heavy with this so that you could see it in the video, but in general I would go light so that you get the hint of the locations of it. And it's not bad that you can see the pencil lines. In many watercolors, even in museums, you can see the original pencil lines, and it's part of the charm of the image. But if you are the type of person who doesn't want to see the pencil lines, then just do it very lightly. So now, step 2. We're going to work on pen and ink of our Blackstone Canal boat image with horses. So when you're working with pen and ink with watercolors, which is what our destination is going to be here, you want your pen to be waterproof. Because if we were using a pen that was not waterproof and drawing all of these things, and then we went over it with water, everything would smear and would be a giant black mess. So the one I happen to use is a Sakura Jelly Roll 06. We did an Uxbridge Sketch Fest. We've done it for a couple years now, and this is the pen that the Urban Sketchers use and recommend, and we ended up finding it was wonderful, so I still use them. But it doesn't have to be this, it just has to be something that is waterproof. That way when we draw stuff and then we paint over it with water, it does not run. Now I will note, this comes out of the pen wet like any other pen. So it starts out smearable, but it dries very quickly, just in a couple seconds. So, but with that being said, be careful when you are drawing that you're not brushing your hand over the stuff that you just drew 2 seconds ago, because it can smear at the beginning. But if you give it a few moments, then it will dry. If it didn't come out wet, it wouldn't leave the pen. So we're gonna, where's my source image? So again, the pencil lines were just a guideline for me. And now that I'm drawing, I want to make sure I look at the source image and think about what the source image looked like. So I could put in ears and other little details that did not necessarily translate clearly. Alright, come on. I'm looking for something to scribble on that I don't care as much about. Well, I suppose I can scribble on this. Why is my pen not working? Trying to see if I have another one of these in my bin. Alright, it helps to have a functional jelly pen. And there's ink in there, but it is not coming out. Now the technique that was always told to me to light the tip with a lighter, which is the reason I have a lighter here, which should loosen the ink up. Loosen the ink up. Well, this may pose a little bit of a challenge here. Why, why? Alright, I may have a slight challenge if I cannot get my pen and ink out. Let me just look over in my bins and see if I have another one out. But that's pretty strange because there's clearly plenty of ink left in there. Alright, so now I have to climb my way around the tripod. It's always an adventure. That's what 2020 is about. So, dealing with these adventures. Alright, none of those are jelly rolls. Oh, there's another jelly roll. Right, that one works. Alright, so that is a good question, why the first one stopped working. Sorry. Alright, so I'll have to put that one aside and figure that out later. But now we have a functional jelly roll pen. Alright, waterproof ink. Now we got the horse, so we'll start with the horse's head. His mane. There's a little guy over in here. The horse's head. Line. So in essence, what you are doing here is making your own coloring book. You are drawing in the black lines that you will then use to color. So at this stage you're not thinking about color, you're just thinking about shapes. You want those shapes of the person and the horse collar. Horse with his tail. And most people learn how to draw by having some tracing in the mix because it helps you build the muscle memory of how horses' legs are laid out, or how people's bodies are laid out, or all the other kinds of things, you know, how churches are formed, whatever it is that you are interested in drawing. Alright, horse number one. And we're doing fairly quick and easy for this demo so that we get things done in time. But if you're aiming for a super realistic image, you could spend quite a lot of time on this drawing process to make sure that you get everything exactly the way that you want it. It is up to you how long you take doing the drawing. Alright. a horse and its tail. So you can imagine that if you have children or artists that are still learning in your life, that the person who is good at tracing could do this part of the process. And this goes through the guidelines and then out to here, where it's tied on out there. So the person who is better at tracing can trace a bunch of images for the other person, and then the other person can sit there and paint or crayon to their heart's delight. And they could work on exactly the kinds of images that they are interested in working on. Now in our case, we can still see bits of the graphite because I went pretty heavy-handedly on the graphite. But if you went gently with the graphite, then you would pretty much be covering up all the graphite at this stage, and you would just see the ink. Alright. The stripes of the boat. I am drawing at sort of an awkward angle here because of this tripod, so some of these lines aren't quite straight, and that's okay. I'm showing a sense of how this all works. Get the windows in here. I love boats, so I would be quite happy tooling along on one of these canal boats. And like I said, I did do a Danube River cruise, where this is what we did. Got on a canal boat, drifted along, went through the locks, got to see all sorts of beautiful landscapes and beautiful towns. So it's definitely a lovely kind of ride to do if you have the opportunity. Alright, so that is how you make the ink part of a pen and ink with watercolor drawing. So it could be your purpose is just to make a pen and ink drawing, and that is quite fine. Lots of people like to hang black and white pen and ink drawings, or I mean you could use different colors ink, blue and white, red and white, whatever color of ink you want to do, and make a drawing, and that's your end product. So that is fine if that's what you're aiming for. If you're doing that, you don't need to use watercolor paper because you're not going to be doing the watercolor part. You could just do it on any kind of paper, printer paper or regular sketch paper. So if your aim is to make a pen and ink sketch, then you could stop there and consider yourself done. Or you could add some more details with your pen and ink. You could add trees in the background or whatever else you were going to add, and you would be done. So what we're going to do is do a watercolor version, which will now have watercolor on top of this pen and ink. And again, you can ask with questions at any point along the way. I am here. I'll type in here. I am here in the chat. Ask questions. Alright, so now we're going to do the watercolor of this. So put this to the side. There we go. I'll put this. Now clearly this is a black and white image. I'm going to do it in color. We don't need the pens anymore. We don't need the snaily anymore. Okey-doke. So, get the brushes are over here. I have a bin of brushes. These happen to be Artist Loft, which is the Michaels beginner brand. You buy these in packs of like 20 brushes for $5. They're very inexpensive, so I have a couple sets that I've bought. But as much as I have all these brushes, just because they come in all these packs, there's a lot of these that I don't use at all. What I tend to use is just one brush and then use the tip for small stuff and use the side for bigger stuff. With this having a bunch of littler details, I might use one of these littler brushes. But in general, that's just what I use, is one bigger brush and one littler brush. And I don't use the rest of the stuff. But, you know, there's always going to be situations where if you have some sort of specific shape, that having one of these flatter brushes is useful to you. But don't feel like it from the beginning you need to have 80,000 different kinds of brushes. It's fine just to have one brush and start with one brush. And in terms of the watercolors themselves, I used to use, oh, I don't even think I have any within reach right now. Oh, I don't see any. So I used to use the pan watercolors, which are the ones that come in a set and they have like the little circles or little squares that are all laid out for you. And the problem with using pan watercolors is if you really like a particular color, like say that particular green, when you buy a pre-made set with the pan watercolors, once you've used up that green, now you've got a hole where the green was and you've got the rest of the colors and you have to buy a whole new pan. In essence, you end up throwing away or giving away the half-used pans because you don't want to have like 5 pans laid out in front of you, each of them in different states of having run out of different colors. So what I do instead now is I bought this tin, and you can buy these on Amazon and Michaels and all sorts of different places, and it comes empty. And then you choose which colors you want to put into it. So you put the colors that you paint with, because the colors I like may be completely different than the colors that you like, and that is fine. So I found the colors that I tended to use a lot and that I like, and you get them in tubes. So then if I keep using yellow, I just keep squishing more yellow into its yellow spot. And if I actually run out of the entire tube of yellow, I can just buy another tube of that yellow. And if I use the green slowly, and I only refill that once a year, then I can refill that at its own rate. And I never have to throw this out, and I'm always using colors just as much as I use them. Like you can see, this blue here is nearly empty, so I will squish some more blue into there. The stuff in the tube is gooey, it's squishy, so it squishes out into there. But once it squishes into there, it dries, and that's fine. You just re-wet it and use it again. So it dries and you wet it and dries and you wet it. Just like those pans, the circles or squares in the pans, those dry out, and then when you want to use them, you just wet them again. So that's a feature of watercolors. Even these little spots where I've been doing mixing, that color is still completely valid. So if I wanted to do something in that color, I just wet that and use that, and that's a perfectly usable color there that's just pre-mixed for me. So I do recommend, after you've practiced with the pans for a little while and get a sense of which colors you like, to get yourself one of these tin things. And these tubes, they're generally not expensive. You can buy a set of 12 of them for $5 or something if you start with the beginning ones, and put in colors and see what you think. And if there's a color that you never ever use, then you can just empty that little square out and put a different color in there that you tend to use more often. So I'm going to start with wet on wet technique. So we're going to talk about multiple kinds of techniques here for doing watercolors. In general, there are two different kinds of techniques you can use. One of them is to make the paper wet and then to paint with a wet brush into the wet paper, which makes the color flow out into wet area and it becomes soft and fuzzy, and that is great for impressionist types of views or background views where you want it a bit fuzzy. And then the second technique is to do wet on dry, so the paper is dry and you are painting with wet paint into the dry area, and the paint stays exactly where you put it because there's nothing pulling the paper out and causing it to, or pulling the paint out and causing it to spread. So we'll show you both of these techniques. So we're going to start with wet on wet because we want the background to be soft and fuzzy. The paper needs to be wet for this to work, and the house is pretty dry right now, so if I tried to make this entire background area wet and work with it, it would dry before I was able to get to it. So I'm going to work on this in sections. So I'm going to work on this top half area first and get that to be the way I want it, and then I'll work on the bottom half area. So the first stage in doing this, and let me just try to move some of these other things out of the way so I can work around my tripod. It'd be nice if the tripod just, or the tripod, if the camera just hung from the sky, from the ceiling somehow, so I didn't have this tripod right in the middle of my working area, but it will be alright. I think I have a little more space as I'm looking at my camera area to put that like that, and that might help with my arm challenges a little bit. Alright, that helps a little bit. Alright, so we're going to get the top area of the paper wet so that when we then add color into it, the color spreads out and forms a soft, fuzzy kind of, I still don't like that pencil in the corner. So it spreads out a little and gives us sort of a soft, distant feel to it. So we're just putting water on the brush, nothing but water. And we are getting this whole area wet. Only the area that we want to be soft and fuzzy, so we are painting around the edge of the boat. So we are making the whole background top wet, and it's already starting to dry, so it just shows how very dry this house is right now. We need to set up some humidifiers, but we'll do what we can do. If you ever watch a watercolor person trying to do this and they are scrambling to do it quickly, this is why, because when things are dry like this, you have very little time to work before everything dries right back out again. I will also comment that the paper will start to buckle a little, and I could have taped it down to the table if I wanted, or I could have pre-wet it so that it goes through its buckling stage and then worked on it, but we are just doing quick and easy right now, so we will just let it buckle a little. When we are done with the completed painting, we can put this under a book or something heavy and it will flatten right back out again. So in general, you don't have to worry about that long term, but it can be a little bit of a pain while you are painting, because now all these bends in the paper will cause the watercolor paint to run downhill, which may not be the direction you want the paint to go in. But part of the joy of watercolors is that the watercolor tends to do what it wants to do, and you have to relinquish control. Right, most of this is wet. Some of this has already dried again, but we will just go as quick as we can. So the general idea of the background is that we have a sky, which I will choose this color. Alright, so you see how the paint is running downhill, and that's generally okay with me. If I didn't want that to happen, I could have taped that down there. Alright, blue, but that blue was completely dry before the paint. And all I had to do was stick the brush in water, stick it over into the paint, and it wets right up and becomes usable. Alright, so we have a blue sky, and you can see that the sky is spreading and moving, and that's great for a sky because it gives the impression of clouds. So we don't have to paint anything in particular. It'll just spread and it'll drift down the little slope, and that's okay. Alright, now I do want to give a general sense that there's a hill back here. Alright. Alright, now we have green for the hill. We'll go with this green here. So this will be a spring day. So these colors will spread wherever there's water because the paint is getting sucked out into the water area. But it will not spread like into the horses. It won't spread into dry areas because there's nothing about the dry paper which is calling the paint into it. So by painting with water, with where we wanted this paint to go, we have set up our boundaries that the paint will go into these areas which we made wet. It will not go into the areas that we made dry. So this will just spread and drift. There'll be a mixing of the blue and green, and I'm okay with that. I like that effect because it adds to this soft fuzzy feel of hills and the softness of a background kind of aspect to it. Alright, I'm going to add some different green in here to make some trees. But again, this is all going to spread and drift, and that is fine. That's why I did it like this. You're just going to give the impression of trees and things back here. Alright, so we've got some darker green trees. Maybe a little bit of this down in there. Well, just to give a sense that there's different kinds of things going on. Maybe some fields over here. But this is all going to blur and blend, so we're not trying to make particular things here. We're just trying to give some impressions. And also note that watercolors dry lighter than they paint on, so all of this will lighten up as it dries. And that is all right. Alright, maybe we'll add a little more blue over here. Spread. You don't need to worry about the very edges because watercolors need to be matted when they're displayed because you never want glass to sit touching the front of a watercolor because watercolors stay active to water, which is why this stuff can dry and then you just add some water and reactivate it. And that means if there's condensation or something where something's pressed right up against the glass, then the painting will stick to it. You know, the same reason that you don't put photos and generally right up against glass. You have a mat around the edge because if the photo gets a little bit wet from condensation, it'll stick to the glass, and I imagine you've seen that happen in the past with albums or photo frames or stuff where something gets stuck to the glass. So since you're going to have a mat around the edge, all of these edges will be covered by the mat that is providing that barrier between the original painting and the glass that's on the outside. Alright. So we have a general sense of a background there that this boat is going next to. Let me just neaten up the little top line here. Alright. So the area down here is water. Well, here it's grass where the horses are walking, because horses generally don't walk on water. So we'll just add that in. And then it'll be water where the boat is drifting, and then there'll be some more grass on the near bank, because canals were fairly narrow, because people had to dig these canals out, and there's no reason to dig space that was wider than necessary. Alright, so that's the towpath that the horses are on. Alright, so now I'm going to use water on the bottom half. And again, the reason I didn't do both at the same time is that a lot of this is already dry up there. So I just didn't have enough time to work on the whole thing at the same time without it all drying out. So now I'm going to use just regular water to wet the bottom half of the paper. So it's all nice and wet, and so that the pigment spreads and mushes in this area. So the only area I need to be careful with is up against the boat, because I don't want the water in the boat itself, because I want to make the boat a particular color. And you could say that maybe I should paint with water the water area that the boat is riding on, and then paint the near grass area, but I have chosen that I want to make a soft fuzzy feel to all of this, so I'm okay with things sort of merging together and to give that kind of a soft feel to it. Alright, so I've got water on this whole bottom half. You can see it curling. I could have taped that down to the table if I wanted to. I chose not to. It creates these curl problems or challenges. There's something to be aware of how watercolor paper works. It also depends on how thick the watercolor paper you use is and what its quality is and all that other kind of stuff. So there's a variety of things that factor into how much it curls on you. Get to know the paper that you work with and what its properties are. Alright, so that's pretty wet. So we'll put in water, which will make a darker color. This will spread out And again, remember that it will lighten as it dries, so it won't stay this dark. My cat is thinking about coming over. Hello, kitty. Are you gonna try to... No. I don't want you to step on the watercolor. In progress. I know, sweetie, you want to be a part of all of this. There you go. Kitty's typing you a message. You, kitty, just go in your tower for now. Alright, so now we have boat in the water. It's a good place for a boat to be. Put some more canal down here. You can see how the color is merging out, which is good. And then we'll put some more bank down here. We'll put a darker bank. How does this green look? Yeah, we'll use that green. Alright. So one thing you want to think about when you create your image with the colors is what the eye is drawn to. I don't want the eye to be drawn to the foreground or this front area or this back area. I just want that to be things that highlight the main part of this image, which is the boat. So I'm going to do the boat in bright red so that catches the eye and draws it in. And the rest of this is just sort of providing a context so that you know that this boat is in a quiet river kind of scene. Or a canal kind of scene in our particular case. But I don't want these things to jump out at you and grab you, so I'm making them nice and soft and fuzzy with gentle colors and just give a sense that there's this grass, maybe some little bushes over here, but I don't want anything to really stand out and jar and grab your attention. Now that being said, you in general want a range of darks and lights in the picture because that adds visual interest and it also adds a sense of depth to it. So right now I'm putting in all medium kinds of colors. You know, they're not really dark, but they're not really light. And again, that way these aren't the things that catch your eye. Oh, see, now, and I had a problem with some of the blue running downhill. So we'll try to draw that back. So again, this is part of the benefit of taping things down or pre-wetting, but usually you can fix things. We'll just go in afterwards with some green and make that greener so that it isn't quite that kind of problem. I have to watch our colors every second. Alrighty. That's better. Alright, so to summarize the wet on wet technique, you make the paper wet and then you use wet paint on a wet brush to go into where that paper is, and the paint will spread out gently into the area that you have. So this is used for soft fuzzy things. You could do a whole painting this way if you chose. You know, a field of flowers, that's just little speckles of red and orange and yellow and so on. People do quite lovely paintings which are all wet on wet. In this particular case, we're using it to be able to make a soft fuzzy feel to this background so that there isn't anything in too sharp of a focus. And you can always go back and alter things. So if you thought these trees stood out a little too much and were pulling the focus away from the main area, you go in with a wet brush and just sort of mush them out a little more. So this is part of the beauty of watercolors, is that you are able to change things after the fact. Now if you put something with a very dark paint, it can stain the paper, so you can't completely erase it necessarily, but you should be able to soften things out a little bit. So that they aren't quite as eye-catching. Which is the main thing to think about. Where does the viewer's eye go when they look at this painting? You don't want them staring at these trees is the most important part. These trees are just supposed to be a little bit of background. You want them to be looking at the boat. Alright, so I think we have a general sense of boat, sky. See, like these sky spots are a little too dark blue. So I'm just going to use regular water to blend them in a little better. That way it's more like there's clouds up there versus spots of dark blue. Alright, it's a little better. Looks a little more cloudy. Like it's a cloudy day. Alright, so the next thing to think about, let me just wash my brush off a little so my brush is clean again. Next thing to think about is the boat and the horses. So we're going to do those with a wet brush on dry paper, because the dry paper will not wick the design out in the way that the wet paper did. And when we paint this area, it'll stay right in the spots that we put it on the dry paper, exactly where we put it. And that's more important for something like this, where you want the shutters to be a certain color and the windows to be a certain color, and so on. So if we look back at the initial picture of the boat, so this is what the model for this one had been, which is white and red. And we could certainly do that if we wanted to. I suppose this one here had mostly white with some kind of a darker trim, which could have been a red trim around the edge. You have to think that just like nowadays, the makers of the boats back then wanted to have something that was pretty and festive feeling, so that people would pay money to go riding on this. They wouldn't want it to be all drab and boring. They're trying to sell the experience as much as they're trying to sell the travel part of it. The Samuel Slater, was all red with black trim. And again, red is good because it's eye-catching in terms of, you know, people on the bank saying, oh look, the boat's going past, maybe we should ride on it sometime, all that kind of stuff. So I think I'm going to make the boat itself red, and I'll probably go with this red with black trim idea. Actually, I think this one is red with dark green trim, but we already have a lot of green in our image. So I want the boat to stand out against that. So I think we'll go with red with black. So you have to think like the boaters back in those days. They want something that would really catch people's eyes when it went past, so everyone would see it, and they wave at it, and they think about it, and they tell their friends about it. It was a form of marketing. And the horses are probably brown. It's a normal color for horses. So part of while we're thinking about this is we're letting this dry. Because if this stayed wet, and then we painted next to it, the paint could get sucked out into the wet area. And now we'd have these billowing spreads of red in our canal which is not the look we're going for. Alright, so I think that the existing layers are pretty dry. They give a reasonably good sense of general hilly backgrounds and meadows and stuff. Alright, let's try to do the horses first. So I did all of that other painting with a big brush. Happens to be the Artist Loft. I'm going to use a smaller brush. Alright, so this is a number 2. They number the brushes in order of size. So if you look at those, the littler one is a number 2, bigger one is a number 9. Again, these are the Artist Loft Essentials, which are quite inexpensive. You can get bunches of them for very little money from all sorts of places. Alright, I'm always taking a risk when I start the next phase and I'm not quite sure that the previous phase is dry. When you do this for yourself, you can wait a little and make sure that it's really dry, but because I don't want to sit here for too long while you're watching without doing anything, sometimes I work on multiple paintings at once. This time I'm just going to go forward on this one. Right, so I have brown paint. We'll see if I get too close to something that's wet and if it sucks it out and makes the grass brown. So I'm painting directly on the dry paper now, and the paint stays where I put it in general, unless I hit a wet area. But it should stay where I put it. And in general, it's actually behaving pretty well, which I am grateful for. So you would use the wet on dry technique if you had something that you wanted to stay in a particular spot, like this horse. We want this horse to stand out as a feature of this painting, so we don't want the horse to be soft and fuzzy, at least in this style. I mean, you're the artist, you can choose whatever you want to choose for the things that you are painting, but in the style that I am choosing to do, I want the horses and the boat to be crisp, and I want the background to be soft and fuzzy so that the focus of the eye is on the horses and on the boat. My cat is coming over to join us. Cat, no, I don't want little kitty footprints in my horses. Come on, sweetie. Sweetie, no, you can't go over there right now. Come on, back up. Yes, I know. No, no. Alright, she managed to avoid the wet horses. Luckily, the rest of what she stepped on was dry already, so I don't see any big kitty footprints in them. It's always an adventure. Right, leg. So, for example, I can't work on this person right now while I am painting the horse, because then the horse colors would blend right into the person colors and so on. It's also good to think in watercolors about layers. The first layer you put on will go on at a certain color, and then it will dry and become a lighter color. And then, as you want to build up shadows and depth, you add layers of color to it. Watercolors can be seen through. The reason that they seem glowy, like a stained glass window, is that the light is going through the watercolor, hitting the white of the paper and bouncing back out, so it's actually backlit from the light bouncing off that paper. And the more layers you put on, the darker and darker it gets, and the less the light is shining through, so that gives you the darker spots. So when you put on this first layer, that is a base layer. And in some areas, like this fuzzy background, you just leave it that way because its purpose is just to provide the thought of a river and the thought of a foreground and so on. But in areas that you want the eye to be drawn to, then you start thinking about lights and shadows and other things. And you think about where the sun is. So in my case, I'm going to imagine the sun is coming from in this corner and shining this way. That means things that are up on this part, closer to the sun, would have the light shining off of it. And areas that were lower, like around the horse's belly and so on, would be in shadow and would be a bit darker. So as this first layer dries, I can start adding in a second layer, which will then make it a little darker in areas like the belly and maybe the front of the face. And I'm using the same color. It's not that I'm changing the color of the horse, but I'm just giving it more of a shadow feel in the areas that are shadowed from the sun. And that starts to add more of a sense of realism. And clearly this isn't very realistic because I'm doing little two-dimensional horses and a two-dimensional boat and so on. I'm giving it that sort of old-timey folk art feel, but still having a little bit of shadow makes the eye feel like these are more real types of objects, and it engages the eye. And also, it's good to have a range of lights and darks in your image because that also engages the eye. So while I have a lot of medium to medium light in the background area, I want to have some dark things, and the dark things will draw the eye into it. So these horses, if I can make them a bit darker, then add that range of values to the overall picture. So we got some darker areas. The backs of the horses are lighter because they have the sun shining on them. Alright, so we'll let that dry. Yeah, make the head a little darker over here. So when I'm doing those kinds of finer details, like I want the belly to be darker and I want the back to be lighter, that's part of the benefit here of working wet on dry, because the paint will stay generally where I ask it to. Although it still spreads a little in this region that I'm working on. So I have to be accepting and patient. Maybe I have to wait for something to dry a little more before I add a little more paint to it, that sort of stuff. Right, so while that is drying, I can think about the boat. So for the boat part, I decided on red with black trim. So even though that one shows white with red trim, I'm going to be doing a different kind of coloring. So we will start with red. And I think, let's see what that red's like. Maybe not that red. How about this red? No, still not the red I'm thinking of. How about that red? That's better. Alright, so we will start with red over here. Alright, I think I will maintain the stripes, so it'll be red and black striped. Now something to think about with watercolors is because you can see through the watercolors, and because it has this notion of layering, that if I paint red and let it dry, and then I paint black, the black will cover up the red. So I don't need to leave spaces for the black, because I can just paint black over the edges of this red and it will cover it right up. So darker colors will cover up lighter colors. But because you can see through these layers, a lighter color will not cover up a darker color. So if I painted a really dark red on here and then said, oh, I want some yellow trim or something, and I tried to paint yellow on top of this, you would see right through to the yellow to the red, and you'd end up making an orange. So you need to think about what colors you're going to use and plan accordingly. Light colors should generally go down first, and then you should be careful not to paint dark colors on top of them unless your purpose is to cover them up. I'm leaving the roof empty. I'm not quite sure if I want the roof to be the same color or different color. Maybe I can make it a different red. Well, I don't know if they'd really paint something a different red. It looks in this drawing like they painted it gray. I suppose I could paint it gray. I suppose red, black, and gray is a reasonable combination. You know, they would have a lot of the same kinds of thoughts that we have. If this is tooling down the river on a bright sunny day and the whole top was black, then it would probably roast the people who were inside, which would not be a calm, pleasant experience that they were hoping for. So I can see gray being a good compromise for a roof color. And the red on the sides would be the eye-catching marketing color to be able to catch the eye of all the farmers and school children and such who were playing along the river, for them to be all excited to see this canal boat. Alright, so that's that. I'll put this in here. Now we're putting this first layer down. This is going to fade as it dries. So we're going to need a second layer and maybe a third layer to be able to give it that nice bright red color that I'm hoping for. So keep that in mind with watercolors. It is a project of layers to get the color that you are looking for and to add the shadows and for all sorts of other reasons. You can ask with any questions. I can see the chat and I can respond if you have any questions. And if you happen to watch this as a recording after the fact, you can post questions anyway and we get alerts. Or you can email us at info@bvaa.org and we can answer questions that way. So BVAA is B as in Blackstone, V as in Valley, A as in Art, oh, sorry, and A as in Association. Blackstone Valley Art Association. We are based in the Blackstone Valley, which is where this Blackstone Canal is located. Blackstone Valley includes a bunch of towns in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island, since it is the Blackstone River which goes from Worcester down to Providence. Alright, I think I need one more layer to make the reds nice and bright. And the hope with this is that when you look at this painting, that it's the bright red and then maybe the darker brown of the horses which draws your eye, and the rest of the stuff, the blue of the water and the blue of the sky and the green of the hills, is just background stuff that doesn't really stand out at all. Right, so now that these areas are wet, it starts to add like wet and wet. So if I just dab color, you can see it spreads out in this wetness that I've created. So that wet on wet technique that we were playing with comes into play here, where I don't have to paint every last little spot, because I can just put color down into the wet area and it spreads out on its own to fill in any area that is wet. So it'll not spread out into the dry area like the roof there. It'll just spread out into the wet area through wicking action. Alright, so you can see as I add in each subsequent layer that the color gets richer and fuller. It looks redder in essence, and that's the look that I am going for. I want a nice bright red boat here in the middle. Alright. Alright, so we'll give that a moment to dry, because if I were to try to do anything else in that area with that stuff being wet, the moment I came too close and touched it, the new color would suck down into the red area, and the red area would suck up into the roof area, and it would just not be quite what I was going for. The horses are closing in on dry, although I can still see they're glistening a little, so they are wet. I might be able to work on the little person. I'm a little nervous that the horses seem a little bit wet over there still, and that if I did something in the person it could run out, but let's find out. This is all a learning process, so this is good to learn. So we'll take a little black for his head. This is the moment of truth. Try to give him a little bit of, I've got a loose hair here. Alright, got the loose hair out. Try to give him a little bit of hair without having it go into the horse. Ah, see, it went into the horse. Alright, well, it's actually not too bad. It's blended in enough with the brown. But this is why one has to be careful. If the surrounding area is still wet, it can run and merge. So, let's put boots on. Could happen again. He's got boots, but see, now I can't do the rest of him because then the black of the boots would suck up into his body, so that is alright. So let's see, I don't know if I can risk the gray of the roof yet. I don't know if I can risk anything else on him, and the horses still seem wet, so I can't even put in the horse colors yet. Alright, so let's think about what we could do next while we're waiting for that to dry. Alright, so this is our pen and ink watercolor, which I let dry for a little bit so that we could try working on interior spaces without the colors running into each other when they're wet. And again, the challenge is that if the horse area is wet and then I try to start painting in the person area and the two wet areas touch each other, the wet areas will blend together because the colors will wick into each other. So it's good when areas are adjacent, if you do not want them to run into each other, to let one area dry. when we did this stuff in the background, we did everything, the paper was wet, the ink was wet, everything ran together, and that was good because we wanted a soft fuzzy feel to it so that it just provided a feel of the background without drawing our attention too much. But now that we're trying to work on the details of the boat, which we want to be sharp in the foreground, we don't want everything to run together to make a giant blur. So we are going to, where are we going to put that? No, we'll put that over there. So we're going to start with the gray roof, I think, and that'll give the middle area a little more time to dry too. Hopefully everything around the gray roof is dry. If not, we will find out. So the paper is dry. Hopefully the paint around this area is dry so that this gray just stays in the dry roof area where we want to paint it. And because we used a waterproof ink when we were drawing these edges, the waterproof ink is not running at all. It is simply staying put, which is what we wanted for this project. Alright, gray roof, and it did not run, so I count that a victory. So now the stripes. Well, I suppose actually we could do the inside windows while we're here with the gray. So I'll make the inside windows gray. A little nervous about getting too close to that red, but I suppose it has to be done. Well, so far it looks like everything's staying where it belongs. So that would be a good thing. Alrighty, we have gray windows, we have a gray roof. And you'll note that the gray roof is drying quickly and drying quite light. And that is fine. I'm fine with a light gray roof. But again, everything dries in watercolors dries lighter than when you painted it on, so if you want it darker, now you'd put on more and more layers to get it to have a darker color. Alright, so we have a gray roof, we have gray insides of the windows, and now we want black stripes and black shutters. So I'm going to start with the bottommost stripe and hope that the area around it is dry, because black is very dark, and if we get black billowing out into our water, that will be hard to fix. So I'm going to turn this at an angle since I'm working around this tripod here. Try to be careful where I put the black. Alright, got the black going in. And again, this looks nice and dark as we're painting it, but it is going to dry later, so if we want that nice rich black color, we'll probably have to do multiple layers just like we did with the red. And that is okay. And you'll probably notice that I'm leaving some white spots. That's because the way I'm holding the brush, I can get it to have a sharp edge on the side away from my hand, and then I'm going to turn the paper around and do a second layer with the sharp edge on the side, again away from my hand, but since the paper will be rotated, it will be the opposite edge, and that way I maintain as much control as possible. And you'll find out for yourself which way your hands work better and adjust accordingly. But for me, when I'm painting, it's the far edge that's I'm able to maintain the most sharpness on. I don't know if you can see how this second layer is already getting darker than it was before. And my aim here is not to be super realistic or super precise. I'm giving sort of an impressionist view of this boat, so I'm okay with a little bit of wiggliness and a little bit of loom. That's alright. And also we're working on a timetable here, so I'm going fairly quick and loose. Alright, we'll start the second layer. So again, I'm just focusing on this top edge right now. I will catch the bottom edge when I flip it over and do that side. That way the black gets multiple passes. Help it get darker. Also that way I use the straight edge that I am best with. Oh, see a little bit of it sucked into the red. That's alright. We're going with an impression of a boat here. If you want to be more detailed on yours, then you could go more slowly. You can use a tinier brush. You can use a steadying block or something to steady your hand. A number of different things you could do. So certainly if you are able to, I recommend trying a ride on a canal boat sometime. It is a lot of fun, and it's the way people for a period of time got around our world. Their other choice was to walk on foot very long distances over rough terrain. Alright. So we got the stripes of the boat in place. Now to try to do the little shutters and see if everything has dried along them so that we can do this. Alright, I think that this might be the best angle for me to approach the shutters from. And also I don't want to get my hand onto the existing wet paint so that I smeared that all around. Alright. Little shutter shapes. So it's probably fun if you were a farmer or a seamstress or something sitting on the edge of the river and seeing this brightly colored boat go by, going far distances as far as you were concerned, waving at the people who are on it. Alright, now the horse still looks wet, but we're going to risk this and try to put some black in the color. And we'll see if it zooms out or not. Oh, it actually stayed pretty much where it should have stayed. That is a good thing. Alright, so the horse collars are in. And we'll give him a red outfit to go with his boat. He'll be color coordinated. Give him little red pants. Now we can't paint his top half for a while because the red pants would just blend right into his top half. Now we could say that there were supposed to be panes in these windows. Chance of painting little tiny panes in these windows is probably slim. But we could put little speckles in there, which give the impression of panes. I'm just a little worried about the black and the shutters getting too close to the speckles of the panes and having everything run. But we'll give it a shot. Alright, so here I will talk about a different aspect to this, which is the use of white in watercolors. So normally when you paint a watercolor, if you want something to be white, like if you wanted the guy's shirt to be white, you would leave the paper white, because that is the cleanest white. That's the light shining down and bouncing off the paper, and it is a nice and glowing stained glass white, just like the horses' bodies are a thin layer of brown over the white of the paper, and that way the light goes through the brown, hits the paper, bounces back off, and makes it look like it's backlit. So again, that's what gives watercolors their glowy aspect. But if I had wanted these window panes to be white, I would have had to try to carefully paint gray around every little pane, and that could be incredibly challenging. So the two ways that people approach this is, one, they use what's called Frisket. This is a masking liquid that protects the paper from paint. So you would take this with a little tiny paintbrush and you would paint in with Frisket the areas you wanted to protect, and it's like a rubber cement, so it's like a goo that dries. So if you painted little panes on here with the Frisket, and then you painted all over it and stuff, at the end you would rub off the Frisket and it would just sweep off the paper, and now those spots would still be white, and they would glow as little white spots in amongst all the other colors. So Frisket is a great way to preserve whites when you are painting watercolors, to keep them white. So for example, if you wanted his shirt to be white, you could paint the shirt with Frisket, and then you could do whatever else you wanted to and not have to worry about it, and at the very end you just rub off the Frisket and the shirt would still be nice and white. So that's technique number one. But clearly we didn't do that. We just painted those little squares gray. So technique number two, which watercolor purists would not agree with because they don't think that anything on here should be anything except watercolors. But the other technique is to use a bleed-proof white. So this is a solid white. It's no longer able to be seen through. It is something that is going to sit on top of the painting and completely block the light. So where this stuff is glowy, because the light is going through, hitting the paper and bouncing back, this stuff here will not be glowy. It'll just be like acrylic paint or oil paint or something, which looks white but doesn't have all of the light reflecting and bouncing. So just be aware that it's a different kind of substance. There are some art shows, for example, that do not want this sort of stuff on a watercolor painting. So if you enter art shows, it's just good to know that that sort of rule can apply. And it will give a different type of aspect to the art you're creating. But in this case, we are just playing, so I'm going to add little white paint spots to add the sense of the 6 panes. And I'm just putting in little spots so they are not glowing white, because I do not want the panes of the window to be the key focus on here. I just want it to be a little highlight so you get a sense that there are panes. But this paint can be very useful, like if you're doing a night scene and you want some speckling of stars. Instead of trying to keep little star spots completely white while you're painting all around them, you can paint the entire sky in whatever blacks and purple colors that you want, and then at the end you can add stars on top, and this will sit on top and be solid enough to be able to block out whatever is underneath it. Alright, So now we've got a sense that there are windows there. See, it's almost a little too bright here where it's drawing the eye. And the aim is not to have the little panes of glass being the focal points of this image. But that gives you a sense of how you can do something like this. And if you wanted to, once that dried, you could then paint a thin layer of gray over that so that it wasn't quite as glaring white. So there are still things you could do to it. But that's something else to know about. So the brand I use is Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White, but there's a bunch of other options here. And generally this would be a final step that you took just to add little white highlights where you did not have them preserved to glow through from the paper itself. And like I said, it would have been fairly hard to keep all of those little white holes open when you were painting around it. Not impossible if you had a very detailed hand, but fairly challenging. So one option is to go in at the very end and add the little white spots that are now sitting on top of all the other colors and fully blocking out the underlying colors so that you can't see through them. Alright, I'm still looking at my little guy and trying to decide if the little guy is safe to paint. I think the answer is probably no. But we might give it a shot anyway. Alright, we'll give him a little red vest, like in our model. Let me try finding an even smaller brush. Alright, this is a fairly small brush. So I can just get his little vest on him. Alright, this is going to be a challenge. So I'm trying to work around this tripod. Alright, vest goes over the shoulders. Under the arm. Goes over here. Over those shoulders. Alright, that's reasonably vest-like. See, now unfortunately the way that the original image was drawn, the horse collar goes right into his head, which is sort of distracting. It looks like he's got this thing sticking out of his head. Maybe if we make his hair, see, we can't really make it brown because it'll blend into the horse. If we make it black, it'll blend into the horse collar. If we make it blonde, I don't think we'd be able to see it. We can make it sort of a reddish color. Well, that would be the same as the vest. Well, let's try it sort of an orangey color. Alright, see if I can get his hair to be a color without blending into all these other things. Alright, that sort of worked. I suppose his skin should have some sort of tone. He's probably suntanned. So if we assume he's got a white long sleeve shirt, now the problem is if we try to do his face, it'll blend up into his hair because that's all wet. Right, so this color here is a good suntan skin color. The average colonial person. Give him little suntanned hands. And we're going to be wild and crazy and just try to get his face in there while the hair is still wet. Alright, that seems to not have run too much. Alright, so he's got a white shirt, a red vest, red pants, orangey hair, colonist suntanned hands and face. Alright, so that is a pen and ink drawing, which we then watercolored in. So then to recap, we started with the original image, which we printed out. We could have drawn the pencil sketch freehand, but what I did was I traced the original image with tracing paper, and then I used graphite paper to transfer this image onto a piece of watercolor paper. So then we had the image on the watercolor paper done in graphite, which is in essence pencil. Then I used a waterproof pen, which I'm looking around to see where I put it. Here we go. So then I used a waterproof pen. I happen to use a Sakura Jelly Roll 6, but you can use any waterproof pen you want. It needs to be waterproof so that when we're doing all the painting later on, we do not smear the pen ink all over creation. So we traced the lines with our waterproof pen, because I like that pen and ink kind of look to it. And once we had the pen down, then we got the background areas wet with just water, and we dropped in color to make different shapes so that the background was soft and fuzzy and all the colors just sort of merged into each other and gave a general impression of the background. And then for the feature areas, we left that dry and we painted with wet paint onto the dry area, which meant that the color stayed much more exactly where we put it. And we manually put down colors into the specific spots that we wanted to in our drawing. So while you're doing that sort of thing, you want to be aware of which areas are still wet, because if two wet areas touch, the colors can blend into each other and merge, which is not what we wanted to happen in these feature areas. We did want it to happen in the background area, so the background would be soft and fuzzy. But in these feature areas, we wanted to keep the different colors separate so that they stayed generally in their space. So this was a very quick and fast version to show you how the techniques worked, but you could certainly do a version where you took your time slowly and worked on it if you wanted to be more precise about where things ended up, or if you like the loose casual feel of it, then you could certainly do that. You are the artist, so you get to choose what you want to do. So ask if you have any questions. You can post in the comments in here and we will see them. You can send us an email at info@bvaa.org, that's Blackstone Valley Art Association.org, or visit our website at bvaa.org. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on Flickr, we're on Pinterest, we're on all sorts of different places.